Hello everyone, welcome to a new series of In Conversation With. Today I'm joined by Tony McAleavy, Director of Education at the Education Development Trust. Tony, welcome.
Thanks, Dan. Good to be here.
Great to have you here. Tony's been part of EDT for a while. We won't talk about the number of years, but Tony's been involved in a lot of the activities over all the growth and expansion of EDT. It'd be great for everyone's benefit, Tony, to just give a brief summary, if that's possible, of your career at EDT.
Wow. Okay. Well, I've been with EDT, previously CFBT, for over 20 years. So a very long time, and feel very privileged, really, to have been working for the organization for so long. I started actually in 2001 and inherited an amazing series of projects. Most of my career to that date had been UK focused. And I did have some UK responsibilities, but somewhat to my astonishment, I inherited responsibilities for projects in Cambodia, Vietnam, Rwanda, and Kenya, and went on the road and visited those amazing projects. And I'm very pleased, actually, that some of the relationships that we developed then have stood the test of time.
I think it's fascinating. I think that's one of the fantastic pieces of heritage that we have at EDT, is that we've been international for a long time, and we've been touching corners of the world in education and skills for multiple decades. In your career and in your experience at EDT, what's been the key highlights? Pick out a few of the key programs, projects that you're particularly proud of, either as an observer or as actually participating and leading.
Well, there are so many spoiled for choice, and I certainly can't take credit for all the achievements that the organization's had over the last few years. I like to think I played a role in the development of our work in the Gulf region. We'd been in Oman for a very long time, but back in 2006, 2007, I was heavily involved in the beginnings of our relationships in the UAE, in the United Arab Emirates. And in that period, we started work in Abu Dhabi and for the Dubai government. Back in 2007, we began the design of the inspection bureau for KHDA, the Knowledge and Human Development Authority in Dubai. And that was an amazing project, starting from scratch, creating a whole new approach to school accountability for the government of Dubai. And Dan, you know that we had the privilege together of visiting the folks in KHDA about a month ago, so in 2024. And throughout that period, since 2007, 2024, we've remained the partners, the strategic partners of the folks in Dubai. So I'm rather proud of that project and delighted, actually, that we were able to establish a relationship that's endured in terms of that strategic relationship.
I think that's one of the most impressive attributes of EDT is we have the longevity of our relationships, decades rather than just years, beyond individual contracts. In terms of your kind of focus of interest around evidence, what role has that played in sort of setting us apart from others who operate in this space, not necessarily in a competitive way, but more of an impactful way?
Well, I think it operates on several levels. One of the things that I've been driving within the organization is the use of our own research funds to create evidence. And I know you're going to hear from Richard as well, our global head of research in this series. In the day, I like to think I played a part in shifting the focus in terms of our research so that we were creating evidence that might be of practical value to our partners. And one example of that would be the research that we did looking at the effectiveness of the school system in Vietnam.
Okay.
Vietnam's a really interesting place. It used to be a low-income country. It's gone through economic transformation. Education's played a key part. It's now a middle-income country. And it does amazingly well in international tests. The kids in Vietnam beat the kids in most European countries when it comes to PISA.
Yeah.
So we set ourselves the challenge of trying to understand why. What was it about the Vietnamese system that led to this highly effective set of of outcomes. And what we learned was that, as ever, things are complicated, but there were some key factors to do with the status of teaching, the way teachers were supported, the accountability system, the way leadership operated, that together were the key ingredients for the success of Vietnam. So we did that research, and we were then able to draw upon that more widely when talking to policymakers worldwide about what works, how they can improve their education systems. So that would be one take on the impact and the evidence agenda. I think we also seek to learn systematically from our own practice what we do. And you can only do that if you take very, very seriously the measurement of impact. So it's a kind of complex issue to do with using evidence from our own research, evidence from a wider global research base, and learning also in action from our own projects.
I think that's fascinating. And I think there's a great example of how there's a connectivity through the organization from research to programmatic to making a difference. You mentioned PISA with the context of a research project. I know we did a great piece of work in another part of the world around PISA and the impact that had. Maybe it's worth just talking about that briefly.
Yeah, well, PISA has become a very important part of the global education landscape. It's a test for 15-year-olds in reading, literacy, maths, and science. And it's undertaken by over 80 countries these days. And I applaud the fact that the policymakers in those countries put themselves on the line, really, in terms of exposing to global scrutiny the performance of their education systems. And one country, we were talking a moment ago about enduring partnerships, one country where we had a very, very successful relationship is Brunei. And the Bruneians made a bold, brave, I think correct decision to enter PISA. And they signed up to PISA for the first examination in 2018. And they asked us to do a really interesting piece of work looking at how well prepared their teachers were for, if you like, PISA scrutiny. And we started that project a couple of years before the first test. So they undertook the test first in 2018. But we began a project, it was called the Literacy and Numeracy Coaching Program, back in 2016. And we spent the subsequent 2 or 3 years seeking to build the capacity of the Bruneian system. First of all, to make the system better, but secondly, to make sure that in terms of the particular focus of PISA, they were well prepared. And what we sought to do was to draw upon the best available evidence of what works. So what works in terms of professional learning and encouraging, helping teachers to perform well? Well, what we know that the professional learning is best if it is based in the classroom, not in an off-site workshop. If it focuses on research-based insights into pedagogical strategies that work, and if it connects with the issues of the subject context. The subject is really, really important. So those were the things we focused on, and we helped to, with our colleagues in Brunei, to establish a pedagogical coaching system within the schools that was based upon those on those principles. And it was very much co-constructed with colleagues from Brunei and embedded. And 2019, we finished our work. We're still working with folks in Brunei on other things, but that project then finished. And fortunately, the Bruneians performed perfectly respectably in 2018. But of course, that was, if you like, the baseline. And we were really, really pleased when we heard not that long ago, last December, about their results in 2022. Usually PISA takes place every 3 years. Because of COVID, it became a four-year interval. And of course, we all know COVID was a disaster for the world in educational terms. And in most countries in the world, the performance of the kids dipped very significantly, 18 to 22. And there was just a handful of countries that bucked that trend. And I think the most impressive of all those turned out to be Brunei. So in Brunei, between 2018 2022, there was a really substantial gain, for example, in the performance of the students in reading literacy. The best improvement, as it happens, in the world. So I think that's pretty cool in terms of
I think it's very
measurement
impressive. I think it's very impressive that we, as a team, could make such a substantive difference to support in the change and the improvement across a nation. I think that's very impressive.
I think we can take some credit for that, but it was very much teamwork.
Yeah.
With our colleagues in Brunei. There was a great team from the ministry in Brunei. And I think one of the best aspects of the project was the fact that it stuck, so to speak. You can have initiatives in education that come and go. This happens all the time in many, many countries. But the LNCP, this coaching approach, has endured. So we finished our work 2019. But here we are in 2024, when I contacted colleagues in Brunei to say, hey, well done. Yeah. They said, it's great because LNCP is still now central to the way our schools operate.
Absolutely. I mean, my recent trip to Brunei, it was visible. It's clearly making a massive difference. And ultimately, the impact is felt by the children and the teachers and the schools it's impacting. That's brilliant. I mean, on our recent trip, Tony and I recently went out to Washington to meet a lot of our stakeholders and partners. And we talked a number of times about the Girls' Education Challenge. And I know you were quite closely involved in that. Mm. What were the highlights of that? And what kind of satisfaction did you draw out of that program?
Well, the Girls' Education Challenge was an extraordinary global project funded by the UK government. And we played an important part within that in terms of our work in Kenya. So the context was Kenya. I think the story in terms of a wider context again illustrates the importance of these enduring relationships. Because actually we've been working continuously with the ministry in Kenya since the late 90s. So when the opportunity came along in 2012, 2013 to start working on the Girls' Education Challenge, we were able to begin to think about how we could help on the strong foundations of a deep contextual knowledge and some great relationships with the folks in Kenya based on the fact that we'd done previous work. And actually one of the previous projects was in itself extraordinary and was focusing on the empowerment of girls. So we did a wonderful project before the Girls' Education Challenge on HIV/AIDS education in schools in Kenya. And it was for the boys and the girls, but there was a big focus on empowering the girls to take charge of their own lives, so that they weren't forced into, if you like, relationships too early, etc., etc. And it was evaluated in a very rigorous way with a randomized controlled trial, and it demonstrated very clearly that we had saved lives because there were changes to the girls' sexual practices, the age of sexual debut, the likelihood of unsafe sex was reduced, and we could prove this because we had the evidence, and that was fantastic. So when in 2012 we had an opportunity to start thinking about Girls' Education Challenge, we had these strong foundations. The project itself was very focused on girls who came from very marginalized, disadvantaged communities. Two in particular, girls living in the urban slums in Mombasa and Nairobi, and girls living in quite remote rural communities in the so-called arid and semi-arid lands. So children from some of the poorest communities in Kenya. And we did what we do. We looked at the evidence, the global evidence, as to what works in terms of encouraging girls to stay at school, helping them to thrive at school. We looked at what we knew about the Kenyan context. We worked with our colleagues in Kenya, and we put together an approach, a kind of multi-pronged, multifaceted approach, which tackled the issues from several perspectives. So working with the communities, working with the parents and the community elders in order to persuade them of the importance of their girls sticking around in school and doing well at school. working with the teachers, obviously, to try to make the schools gender responsive and friendly places, and talking a lot to the girls, because I think the voice of the beneficiaries is such an important ingredient.
I mean, that was a really important part and a really highlight of my visit to Nairobi earlier this year. Just seeing that passion in the girls.
Because you went to the slums.
Absolutely. And the passion of the girls, the engagement. I think it was the opportunity they saw. Yeah. I think that was the most important thing. They saw a future in a very different light to what I imagined it was before.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I said before that the voice of the girls is so important. Yeah. And I think actually it's something that we've taken very seriously in terms of the evaluation. Yeah. So we've got some great crunchy numbers about the number of girls who stuck around, who did well in their academics. But we also spent a lot of time talking to the girls to try to make sense of the big challenges that many of them were facing, and what they were gaining from the program. So really brilliant project.
In terms of the sector as a whole, in terms of international development, particularly focused on education, what do you think that the sector as a whole could do in terms of improving the way that there are impact measures for success?
I think that there's a growing consensus, really, that this is vital, that that over the years, huge amounts of money have been invested in education reform. A lot of it in bricks and mortar in low-income countries. And we've made lots of progress in terms of enrollment. Kids are much more likely to go to school, but do they thrive at school? Yeah. Well, I'm afraid in lots of countries the answer is no, and we only know that because we take seriously measurement. So getting the data right is first base, really, for education reform in these contexts. You need to know where the kids are at in terms of their current learning levels, so that you can make progress. And then you've got to use methods that we know are likely to work. And we've got a growing body of knowledge about pedagogies that work. And then we've got to persuade policymakers to take this seriously. And that's something that we've been thinking about a lot recently. So how do you do that? Increasingly, we're talking about implementation science. It's not enough to have a great idea. You've got to think about how practically can you implement this round here. So there's an interesting new body of knowledge developing around implementation science, and the need, for example, to be thinking about how we build coalitions for change, how we get the community involved, and the importance of the politicians at the highest level really getting it, that evidence matters, that using the right methods is the only way that they're going to get a return on their investment.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to hear. I think it's really important, and we do that with a degree of passion at EDT to connect the research to the consulting and advisory piece, to the programmatic work, so that we're actually gathering not only the information support and policy, but the elements of implementation science, and increasingly talking to policymakers and funders about the need for evidence. I think that's really important. Tony, it's been a fascinating talking to you. One final question. If you weren't in education, what other career or job would you have wanted to do?
Oh, well, that's very easy, because my passion since I was about 5 is ancient and medieval history. I don't know why, but I've always been obsessed, actually, with history. I did history at university, and I toyed between becoming an archaeologist and becoming a school teacher. And I chose teaching, and I don't look back. I'm very privileged. I've had a really, really interesting career. But when I was a student, I did a lot of archaeology, and that's what I would have done. I would have been an archaeologist.
Well, I am glad you chose this route. I think the world missed out on an Indiana Jones from the UK. If you'd like to hear more about what Tony's done, obviously, please go to our website, edt.org. There's a lot of work and papers, and I'm sure you'll find more information there. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'll be back with another conversation soon.